do now, because I'm chatting with Chris Clark, who I've known for quite a long time, and so me and Chris go back a bit of a way. So I think we met Chris. I mean, introduce yourself before I start rambling on. But I mean, I think we met back in 2008, so it's some time ago, isn't it?
Rob, yes, good morning. We did, and you came for a farm walk on our farm in North Yorkshire. And on that farm, we had a blanket bog, and you disappeared on your own for 2 or 3 hours, briar fighting.
Yeah, I am slightly obsessed with peatlands, of course. That was my first love. Still my first love, I think. Well, my wife, I suppose. Yeah, no, and it's a beautiful, beautiful piece of blanket bog. In fact, it's the most gorgeous location. I mean, it's an absolutely fantastic part of the Dales. What led you to go to Nethergill?
Well, before I got married, my wife and I, who wasn't my wife then, my fiancée, and I decided that we were going to own a farm by the time we were 50. Neither of us come from generational farming background, and everything that we did in business terms was there to raise money to buy a farm, and we bought 400 acres when I was 49 years and 6 months old.
And tell me about this farm. So, it's just the most gorgeous place, but tell me why you chose that location. Just describe the farm to the audience here.
So we don't have the farm now. We sold it. We've now got a smaller farm in North Devon. But at that time, we bought 400 acres, and it was right at the top of Wharfdale. We were at the source of the River Wharfe, Outer Shore Beck, and it had 250, 300 acres of blanket bog and some very poor in-by land. And the house was at 1,200 feet. The farm rose to 1,800, 2,000 feet, and we were there to make money, and we struggled.
And I mean, that's not atypical of a Dales farm, So the Dales farms typically aren't making that much money, if any money, I suspect. Is that me generalising too much, or is that about right?
No, that's absolutely right. And we found exactly the same. We managed to raise enough capital to buy 400 acres because I ran a management consultancy with my wife. And so all the business plans that we had put in place never materialised on this farm. And it wasn't until we began to analyse what we were doing wrong and how we could improve that we began to understand this concept of the sweet spot, and we'll come on to that in more detail a bit later.
So my memory of those early days at Nethergill is that you were effectively following a sort of classic farm diversification model, because the farm operation itself, traditional sheep graze farm and all that kind of stuff, really was not economically viable, and so you were starting to think, I think you did B&Bs and cottages and all that kind of,
Yeah, so we arrived with a Swaledale sheep flock, which we tried to emulate, but it just didn't generate any margin. And we then introduced beef cattle, and actually what we found was that as we reduced output, rather than driving output, which is what I've been trained at Seal Hayne to do, as we reduced output to a certain point, then our losses actually became profits.
So so this is the beginning of the sweet spot concept, which I think is a really interesting concept. So you're on a journey here. So this is a very practical farm-based journey. This is not some sort of academic,
No.
analysis. This is pure on-the-ground journey. So you're trying to develop this farm. You're diversifying it on one hand. But actually the farm holding itself, you're looking at, because you're a business consultant, you're a farm consultant, you are starting to look at all of the costs in this farm operation and all of the income that's coming to the farm operation. What did you find, and how did that lead you towards the sweet spot?
So we analysed each enterprise in its own right. So we looked at the bed and breakfast, we looked at the holiday lets, and in actual fact, in management accounting terms, we asked the holiday lets and the bed and breakfast to pay a rent to the farm. So we could analyse the success or otherwise of those two diversification. Then we looked at the beef and sheep, and we analysed the profitability of those. And until you break each enterprise down into its individual SBU, strategic business unit, you don't know how to make a decision to change.
So, I mean, this is really interesting. So, I mean, I find this figure quite staggering, but I think it's true that 70% of hill farmers actually don't run a business plan. They don't actually write any of this stuff down. It's mostly done in their heads.
I think you're being optimistic with that.
Optimistic.
I think you might be right with 80% of all farms don't, but in the hills, we have now analysed 300 farm businesses, over 300 farm businesses. We rarely come across businesses that have proper budgeting techniques in place. Rarely. And we very, very rarely come across businesses that have management accounting or understand their statutory accounts.
So this is a pretty fundamental point, but let me just come back to the story. So let's take the sheep business, for example. So you were running a Swaledale sheep flock there, and then you started to say, okay, if I consider this as a strategic business unit, to use the sort of MBA type language, you know, how did it stack up? I mean, and is there any way of making a business like that profitable in a place like the Dales?
Well, the first thing you have to do on any farm, whether it's the hills or lowland, is to decide, if you've got livestock, are the livestock the right breed for the right land, the right landscape in which we're wanting them to succeed? And the first thing we did was change Swaledales to a different breed, which were Dales breds.
Right, so that's pretty radical in the Yorkshire.
It was
Dales.
radical,
You know,
and
that's not going to make your neighbours happy straight away.
Well, it wasn't, and we now know why that decision back in 2010, whatever it was the right decision, because Swaledales have, I mean, I hope there aren't any Swaledale producers here.
Could get into a lot of trouble here.
So Swaledales have a genetic deficiency in that they have been bred to produce more than 1.5 lambs, so as many as lambs as you can, but they haven't had, as an additional genetic improvement, enough milk to feed the additional lambs. And that means those ewes and those lambs have to be fed with bought-in concentrates, which in fact is an industrial energy-based input.
So, and what are these concentrates made of, and where are they coming from?
Sorry.
So, what are the concentrates made of, and where are they coming from?
Well,
Typically?
they're cereal-based,
Yeah.
and they could be soy within that. But one of the concepts of the sweet spot is that you can't get more energy out than you put in. If you buy purchase concentrates, if you buy fertilizer, the energy that's gone into the manufacture of those cannot be recouped in the food that you sell. Food being a fuel is energy, and farmers are subject to all the laws of physics associated with energy that BP, Shell, renewable energy companies have to contend with. Farmers are energy producers at the end of the day, and they are some of the most important producers of energy in the UK economy.
So, I mean, these are really interesting technical concepts, but just to stick to the Nethergill story, because I'm just interested in how the journey really that takes you towards a sweet spot. We'll just explain the sweet spot later. But so you've looked at the sheep operation, change the breeds and get rid of concentrates. That massively reduces your input costs. Then you start looking at the cattle operation. What was the journey there when you looked at that?
So when we first went to Nethergill, there was no beef. It was all sheep.
Yep.
Too many sheep. And we then had to choose the breed. And we went for a white-bred shorthorn, native breed. And the reason for that was that we believed that the size of the rumen as a percentage of the body weight of the animal was larger than most. The white-bred shorthorn could cope with the worst silage in the world that we made at Nethergill. And they not only could cope with that really poor silage and poor grass, poor grazing, they produced calves, and they produced milk for those calves, and we turned those calves into ready meals.
Fantastic. So the conundrum of a place like Nethergill, of course, is from a wildlife trust perspective, or from a wildlife perspective, it's absolutely gorgeous. And it's the most rubbish farming. So, you know, this is very marginal soil, isn't it? So
It is.
Fantastic wildlife. And to be fair, you get paid for some of that. You get paid for some of that wildlife through,
Indeed.
in those days, countryside stewardship and so on. But of course, yeah, makes really poor silage or really poor hay and so on. And that's, of course, why many farmers in the Dales have actually massively fertilised parts of the dales and have switched to a kind of monoculture ryegrass silage operation rather than the beautiful hay meadows that you had at Nethergill.
But even in those days, we realised that we had to have a farm business that was profitable, made a contribution on a pre-support basis. So the support, we used the support to contribute to our drawings. We did not use the support to cover the working capital, the daily working capital of the farm business. And we're advising farm businesses right now to do exactly the same thing, because the likelihood of farm businesses having access to support is really, really uncertain.
Yes, I mean, these are going to be uncertain times. And we'll note that in Wales, the farm budget is already decreasing. So they've reduced the national farm budget, the Welsh national farm budget, by 15%, I understand. So, you're beginning to see politicians making a choice between agricultural support and, say, funding the health services and so on. So you're absolutely right to say these things. Really we should be looking at profitable farming before support, not after support. So that's quite an important point. Okay, look, the Nethergill journey, I mean, it's just the most fantastic farm, fantastic place. You're really analysing the businesses, and it starts to move you towards this concept, which you call maximum sustainable output, or the sweet spot. So just take us through, what exactly is this concept?
So the sweet spot is the point at which the farm is most profitable. It's the point at which nature is optimized, and it's the point at which the energy burden on the farm is minimized. So there are three issues there, three benefits that come from the sweet spot. But for farming, the most important is the first one, where profit is maximized, and that is because in farming there are two types of energy. There's the solar energy that we've not got quite so much of today, and there's the industrial energy. And when you split your costs up based on the two types of energy, solar, free issue, and industrial, the whole economics of farming changes. And it leads you to a point that is calculable, where the energy, when the energy runs out, when your grass runs out, that is the point of maximum profitability.
So you picked this concept up. I mean, if we go back to the Nethergill sheep operation, you picked this up in the really high cost of concentrate, which is effectively drawing energy through a fossil fuel production system. So you're using the solar energy of the Carboniferous age, extracting that out, pouring it back into the atmosphere, and using that energy. But it's expensive energy. This is expensive to extract, expensive to turn it into fertilizers, to turn into seed, to turn into the crops that then produce the concentrate for your sheep. This is not a cheap operation, and by stripping that out, you move towards the sweet spot. Is that correct?
Indeed. At a risk of repeating myself, you can't get more energy out than you put in. If you could do that, you would have a perpetual motion machine, and we haven't really understood that in farming. One other observation: I would never have got to this point without physics and mathematics. And one of the team who's in the audience today is a physics and mathematics graduate.
Right, yeah.
Okay?
Yeah.
And so, and he and I have worked together off and on since the late 1980s. In fact, Brian helped us when we were a tenant farmer. We were trying to understand how to cut up a pig and how to cut up a lamb, and price it. And Brian used the physics of a blast furnace to tell us the best way to break up a lamb.
I love this. It's like, yeah, I love this stuff. It's very technical. But there's just, so you've moved towards this concept of sweet spot. How did you develop that concept into something that you sell as a consultancy, but actually you're spreading the word through the regenerative farming industry? We're still there.
We do sell it as a business model as part of our consultancy work, but we are driven by the need for farmers to be successful, and we, through Brian's physics and mathematics, have developed algorithms, proprietary algorithms, that do this calculation of where the sweet spot is. And it actually goes on from there. We now calculate the energy input on every farm. We look at the energy input from the solar, from the free issue, and we look at the energy input from the fertilizer and feed, and we look at the effect of industrial energy inputs on the profitability of farms. And every single time there is an industrial energy input, profitability is decreased.
So I think what's really interesting about the sweet spot is that the implications of it are so radical. So if we go back to that upland example in Nethergill up in the Dales there, I mean, I think it's right that you said, well, that actually if you do those SBUs and you analyse it using the sweet spot methodology, sheep might actually come out of the picture altogether, or maybe certain breeds that make it work. Cattle certainly can work, but at very much lower levels than the sort of cattle grazing you typically have in those. Is that correct? Am I reading this wrong?
You're almost correct.
Yeah.
The least profitable livestock farm on our database is all sheep. The next least profitable is all cattle. The most profitable are a beef sheep LSU ratio of 60-40 in favour of beef. They are the most profitable farms.
And at what sort of density in the?
So, at the moment, on using our database, there is a need for a reduction of between 12 and 18% of output to get to MSO, to get to the sweet spot. Okay, so it's not huge, but if you do it and you plan it properly, over a period of time, 3 or 4 years, the natural soil fertility rebuilds, and you can almost get to, or actually get to, your previous output using industrial fertilizer.
You see, this is incredible. So what you're saying is that actually you apply the sweet spot methodology, output goes down in the first instance, but actually as the soil rebuilds and you don't need those industrial inputs, output can start to rise back up again.
Indeed. Indeed.
So it's the ultimate win-win, this, isn't it?
It
it's almost your perpetual time.
It is. What we're trying to do is to work with nature, not substitute for it. Let's not compromise nature in any way, and understand that farm revenue, farm profitability, is built on the natural capital within that farm business. If you degrade that farm capital, that natural capital, if you compromise it, if you abuse it, your profitability will decrease.
Now, the sweet spot is a system that developed in the Dales, but you've now moved to Devon as well. So, and you're now advising farmers in every form of agriculture. So, just explain how the sweet spot works in, say, an arable system.
Well, we're looking at, we've now, of 300 farms, we've done about 20 or 30 arable farm businesses and 30 or 40 dairy farms. So we now have a fairly wide breadth of experience. So arable farms is actually quite tricky, particularly if they've had no livestock for a period of time. And it's also tricky if they are on the urban fringe, where they can't have livestock. They can't put fences up. We have to find an arable rotation that is virtuous without livestock. Now, there are people in the audience who'll know much more about that than me. But we're now calculating the sweet spot on arable farms on the amount of nitrogen. So we're looking at how much nitrogen is available atmospherically in the soil, and how much is needed to be made up by the artificial nitrogen. And can that need for nitrogen be made up with legumes, or can it be done with livestock? And just going on from that, just let me give you an example of a livestock farm where we're measuring the sweet spot with energy. One livestock farm in the north of England managed to harvest 2 million megajoules of energy in grass.
So just get that right. So the energy equivalent of that grass
was 2 million megajoules.
Megajoules, which sounds like a lot.
The cost of growing it and harvesting it was about £10,000.
Because essentially that energy is more or less for free.
Exactly
so
that.
You're not really paying for that energy. Yeah.
They then bought in 250,000 megajoules of energy instead of 2 million, and that cost them £28,000.
Yeah, which just sounds ridiculous that we would ever consider that.
Absolutely.
And yet most farms do that
all the time,
on a daily basis.
All the time.
Yeah.
2 million, 10,000, 250,000, 28,000.
And we wonder why farming, or conventional farming, is not.
Why it relies on support to such a high degree. The level of support is about as a percentage of revenue on our database is 55 to 60%. The support as a percent of revenue. Take the BPS away, and there's a huge problem.
I mean, this is a really interesting. Do we have any questions from the audience for Chris? Because this is really fundamental stuff, I think, in our journey towards regenerative farming. Yeah, we'll take one there, and then we'll go across.
Yeah, thank you. This is such a fascinating conversation. I guess my question comes from the support side of things, which is that it sounds like what you're doing as a consultancy is really transitioning sheep farmers into these types of systems and advocating for more. But how do you expand that support? Is it peer-to-peer learning? I'm hearing lots from the last 2 days of farmer cluster groups. Like, what's the next step for farmers to be accelerating the transition to the systems that you're advocating?
Interesting question. So the 300 farms that we have reviewed, we've done in-house. That is moving now to us training trainers. So we are, over the last 6 weeks, we've done 5 workshops where we're training trainers to go out on farm. Huge problems within the industry. I mean, I just love Groundswell, but there's nothing here about farm economics, not proper farm economics. We're being told about breeds, we're being told about regenerative farming, but we're not being told how to measure that regenerative farming in profitability terms. And yet, if a farm as a business isn't profitable, we have a real problem. So training conservation advisors, training farm advisors into proper business management techniques, which includes SFI, CS, really, really important. I mean, we have seen over the last, again, few months, we've seen 4 consultants' reports that have been funded by the DEFRA Resilience Scheme. Their conclusions, or their recommendations, even worse, in every case, was to increase their SFI, not to improve their farm business. You need to do both. You need to have a core farming business that is actually contributing to the farm exchequer, not taking it out.
Thank you. There's a question here.
Thanks, Rob. Yeah. My name's David Lord. I'm a arable farmer still, just from the other end of Essex from here, near Clacton-on-Sea. And I'm incredibly fortunate to be one of the people that Chris and Brian have done MSO. So they've done it on my farm, and they did it about 5 years ago. I mean, Chris is up there doing the talking bit. Brian is just an incredible person for I mean, yeah, a couple of hours on Zoom with these guys, and you need a dark room. But for me as an arable farmer, we've been on this regenerative journey, and it wasn't until I was chatting to Chris that I really came across a way of benchmarking how our farm was changing, where we needed to improve, and it really highlighted to me the things that stuck with me were the things like the free issue goods that Chris talks about, which for us in the dry east, water, absolutely essential. Sunlight we have loads of, but how can we maximise the use of both of them? And it all comes down to the soil, and every way we can make the soil better, it's going to hold more carbon, and it's going to hold more water, and it's going to process more sunlight. All those things, it really focused our mind. Sorry. And it also made me understand nature's contribution to my profit and how integral that is to my balance sheet, which a normal set of accounts just won't do. You don't get that that side of it. How we're changing now as a result, we are going to incorporate livestock back into our farm. We used to have dairy cows, and we've seen how our soils have degraded because of the lack of livestock on them. So that is changing, and we can use this MSO system as a way of as a yardstick, so we can see how we're moving in time, and benchmark our progress. My question for Chris is, so we're supplying people with products. One thing that we grow quite well in our part of the world is milling wheat. Milling wheat, we know they need high protein, and currently the best way of putting that is to load up with nitrogen. We know we can produce bread with lower proteins. How do we get this conversation going with the supply side of where our produce is going, to try and get them to interact with this to help us improve the way that we farm?
There will be a. We've been producing bread in this country before we had to load wheats up with nitrogen. The genetics of milling wheat now require that level of nitrogen. So we need to have a look at the genetics based around the sweet spot for milling wheat and for malting barley, for example. We're currently working with a 10,000 acre arable farm, where the farm manager wants to, at least is considering MSO, and the owner wants to rewild. So we got some difficult conversations going on there, and on that farm we are looking at nitrogen balances. How much nitrogen comes down from the atmosphere, how much nitrogen comes up from the soil, and what is the requirement of nitrogen for the milling wheat that is grown on that farm, and how much, what is the deficit and where's that coming from? So ask the question in 6 months' time, and I might have a better answer for you. But I would like to turn the tables on you and ask you about risk. When we first started working with you, how did you perceive MSO and the risk, moving to MSO and the risk it was to your business?
So the risk of MSO to our business?
Of moving in that direction.
Moving in that direction.
So, reducing output.
So I knew that was the journey we had to go on, because it was going to make us more resilient. Anything we're going to do to improve the soil is going to make us more resilient. But we're farming not just for ourselves, but we're farming for other people.
Yeah.
And in order for us to sell, they're wanting us to come in and make the money. And if I can put something in front of them that says, look, by reducing this and producing slightly less, we're going to get more. That's quite a hard thing for someone to understand. By putting figures in front of them, they understand it, and we can, make a difference.
Brilliant. Okay. Thank you.
Yeah, there's a question at the back there. Sorry, question at the back there.
More kind of a follow-on, really, from what the gentleman was saying. Then surely we need to be asking a different question. Instead of just how much nitrogen is in our wheat, is how many other micronutrients are in the wheat, because we're starting to realise that actually that's as important for our people's health as the nitrogen. We've got plenty of calories. We need the nutrients.
I think you're right. But this is a journey, and there is a need for bread and carbohydrate, and we need to move this in a direction slowly. Getting farms to MSO is tricky enough without getting them to change micronutrients at this stage. And it's probably worth saying at this point that we can get pilloried, because the claim is that MSO, the sweet spot, is impinging on food security. But actually, in this country, our agricultural industry is unprofitable without support. How can you have a proper food security policy when the inherent industry is unviable? We need to get the industry viable, and when we do that, and there's enough evidence now from ourselves and from others, that even when you don't use industrial energy nitrogen, you can produce as good as the best of the rest in yield.
Great. Do we have any other questions from the audience? Yeah, there's a question at the back there.
Hello. You may or may not remember me, Carrie Starbuck.
I do.
Yeah. Last year we talked about working with tenant farmers in the Peak District, and it was really challenging to get you in front of those farmers, because the farmers were quite anti what you were doing, or anti the message, or the perceptions of the message, essentially. And I would be curious to hear your thoughts about how we can work more with those types of farmers that are perhaps a little stuck in their ways or more conventional and don't want to hear your message. Like, how do you think you can reach this and gain to a wider audience?
Well, I can help you a little bit, because I know now more why you were having trouble getting farmers.
Well, I'm not there anymore, but yeah,
well,
I've
yes,
moved on to the
exactly.
Wildlife Trust, but yeah, it's fine.
So we did do a project in the Peak District, and I can't remember how many farmers it was, whether it's 15 or 16 farmers. The first farm that I went on to report back on the business review, the question from him was, why are the NFU so against you? Mm-hmm. So you struggled because the local NFU were against what we were doing. Mm-hmm. That's why you struggled.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Yeah, I think also as well, it was it's very vulnerable process to share with you their financial information.
Indeed.
And in upland farming, in that particular context, wasn't profitable. They were under a lot of stress and pressure from external factors, of course. So I think for them, for farmers, it's a really process that requires a lot of trust in you.
Yeah, it does.
I think, and that vulnerability, I don't think anyone was in a position to do that as well. But so that's what I just wondered, like, you know, the chap in front of me, you've worked with them, and like maybe you're already a convert because you've got nature-friendly farming in your back, so I can tell. But you know, that process of going, actually, I'm going to share my financial information with, you know, pretty much a stranger. You know, there's a lot of work you have to do before you're even reaching
The
that.
farmers are quite often embarrassed
Yeah.
because they viscerally know that the business that they're running are completely unviable and entirely reliant on support. You have some farms are up to 90% of their revenue comes from support. So opening up to someone like me can be tricky. The way you get round that, and I'm going to be incredibly sexist now, go to the woman. We always go to the spouse in an upland farming family if we want change. She will deal with the change in a completely different way to the bloke. Completely. Always beneficial.
Yeah, I don't think that's sexist. I think a matriarchal society is perhaps the future, but it should all be in Barbie land. But yeah, you're quite right. It's a family business often, and so it's working with the family, isn't it? Yeah.
Yeah.
These are really fundamental discussions. So in Wales, 92% of Wales is in less favoured areas, and in those less favoured areas, I think it's 90% of farm income comes from the state through various BPS and subsidy and so on. And that is obviously that's going to change. We've got the Welsh Agricultural Act coming up very soon, so that's going to change to public benefit payments. But the farm budget is going down as well. So, you know, actually, most farmers in Wales, that's just one example, it's true everywhere else, but most farmers in Wales are in desperate trouble now. And so farming to the sweet spot is absolutely part of the solution to the what is an economic crisis. You know, it's equivalent to the miners' crisis or the steelworkers' crisis of the 1980s. So I think we are really at a really critical juncture in agriculture at the moment, and I think it's very unhelpful sometimes from the NFU to put their head in the sand on some of this stuff. Question from you, sir.
Yeah, thank you, Chris. It's very interesting. My name is Jonathan. I'm an arable farmer from North Yorkshire. I'm actually a mathematician as well, and also have an interest in a seed company, so I've got a foot in quite a lot of different camps. Very interesting you see in your approach to being accepted onto farms, because I have a lot of involvement. I have 300-acre farms that are making a profit. I have 3,000-acre farms that are losing money hand over fist. If a combine breaks down on a large farm, they're very quick to get the local dealership in at £100 an hour. If a cow's something wrong, they'll get a vet in at a similar price. The very last thing they will give you access to are the accounts. And that's the very first thing they should be addressing, because they are in a mess, a proper mess.
Indeed. And because we have such a large database now, we are beginning to develop KPIs, key performance indicators. And one of them is on veterinary costs, vet and med costs. And we have farms that we have reviewed that are at 20 to 25% of their pre-support revenue is vet costs, whereas the average is around about 5 or 6%. But getting them to change from their veterinary policy, as advised by the veterinary professional, to change their approach to vaccinations, for example, as an insurance policy, rather than a necessary application of medication, is really difficult. But at 20% of your pre-support revenue, you cannot make money as a livestock farmer when your vet and med costs are at that level. Not possible.
Also, just going back to my neighbour here, talking about integrating livestock back onto arable farms, my grandfather said to me back in the mid-1970s, "You'll never be able to farm without arseholes on a farm." He was correct, but it's taken me about 45 years to realise he was correct.
Fantastic. Do you know, that might be quite a nice way to wrap up this session. I mean, we could talk about this all day long, but really, really interesting stuff, this. I mean, I just think this is absolutely fundamental to the regenerative farming transition. And you know, we know that British agriculture is in a bit of a mess, really, you know, and yet there's so, you know, look at the atmosphere in this conference and this festival. You know, there are so many good things out there, and this is one contribution to it. And, you know, I'm really pleased that I was just a tiny bit of that journey right in the beginning of it. So thank you very much, Chris. A round of applause for Chris.
Can I just before you go, one last thought. A farmer came up to me and said, how can I be a regenerative farmer? And the answer is incredibly easy to measure. Be at the most profitable point that you can be. Because when you are at that most profitable point, you are maximizing your profitability, you're optimizing for nature, and you're minimizing the energy burden on that farm.
Marvellous. Thank you, Chris.